What is the mind? What is consciousness? Where does it come from? Is it a product of the brain, or is it a separate independent process? These questions have intrigued mankind's most eminent thinkers and researchers for millennia, and are part of an ongoing scientific and philosophical debate called the mind-body problem. In this episode of Do You Mind, we analyze challenges found in the field of psychiatry, and a still misunderstood identity disorder, suggesting that the mind may not be, as commonly believed, a product of the brain, but instead an intertwined, yet independent process, with a near-complete ascendancy over the body. The field of psychiatry focuses on the diagnosis and treatment of mental and behavioral disorders. Here, all common or uncommon mental phenomena are believed to be a combination of neurochemical activity and environmental factors. However, some phenomena seemingly contradict the purely physiological causation of the mind, and can offer valuable insights that often remain overlooked. Before we analyze relevant mental phenomena, let's have a closer look at the modus operandi and results of this branch of modern medicine. Diagnosis in psychiatry is largely based on a manual of disorders and symptoms, known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM-5. Its reliability and validity have sometimes been questioned, due to its lack of a causative or explanatory basis for most mental illnesses. It is no wonder that such a classification should be superficial or debatable, when there is no consensus on what the mind is, and consequently, on what a mental illness is. Regardless of its lack of factual basis, the seemingly logical interpretation of the mind as a product of the brain proposed by cognitive neuroscience is overwhelmingly adopted in psychiatry. One particular disease was considered proof for neurological mental causation, due to its infectious nature. The sexually transmitted infection known as syphilis is believed to have originated in the Americas, and to have been carried back to continental Europe by Christopher Columbus crewmen. In more advanced stages of the disease, an infection may arise in the central nervous system, and lead to neurosyphilis, with symptoms of dementia, mania, psychosis, or depression. Such an infection-based psychiatric condition led researchers to believe they had unveiled proof for a purely neurological causation for the mind. Although such causation has never been demonstrated, it remains a convenient belief for many. Nevertheless, the main motivation for the near-absolute adherence to the physicalist view on the mind in psychiatry is rather blatant. With psychiatric drugs grossing an estimated $30 billion a year in sales worldwide, according to analytic provider Global Data, it is not surprising that an interpretation favoring a neurological causation for the mind should be preferably presented as authoritative. Be that as it may, this shall not deter us from properly examining the actual benefits of this field of medicine for patients. The efficacy of a given medication is evaluated in clinical trials, where a group of patients is prescribed the medication being tested, while another group, called control, is prescribed a placebo, a flour pill with no active substances. All participants are informed that they are testing a new drug, and are interviewed periodically, being asked to evaluate any perceived benefits or side effects. The results of individual trials are often compiled in meta-analyses, for larger amounts of data may provide a more balanced view. Meta-analyses by Kirsch et al. On the efficacy of antidepressants for depression, and by De Vries et al. For general anxiety disorder and panic disorder, found that they only reached the criteria for clinical significance in very severely ill patients. In other words, for patients with mild or moderate disorders, the the risk-benefit ratio of such antidepressants can be unfavorable. Another meta-analysis by Cipriani et al., which curiously received intense media coverage, claimed a definitive proof for the efficacy of pharmacological treatments for major depression, only to see its methodological inaccuracies later exposed by Monkman et al., who concluded that it is unclear whether antidepressants are more efficacious than placebo. Finally, a systematic review by Hoon et al. Of 61 meta-analyses on 21 psychiatric disorders compared the efficacy of pharmacotherapy and psychotherapy for adult psychiatric disorders, and found no consistent differences between the two. In other words, psychotherapy, which presents almost no side effects, withdrawal symptoms or potential long-term health complications, has proven to be just as efficient as medication. But one could logically ask, how can this be? How can therapy be equally beneficial, if the mind and its illnesses are in great part the products of neurochemicals in the brain? Clearly, significant aspects of the mind and mental illnesses remain unaccounted for. That being said, such considerations should not be misinterpreted. No one could reasonably deny that millions of people do benefit from psychiatric drugs, and that no matter how low their benefits are on average, they are certainly life-changing, and even life-saving for many. Far from disencouraging the use of psychiatric drugs, we instead point to the urgent need for better long-term evaluations of their efficacy, and a greater responsibility for health professionals in bringing unbiased information to patients on the risk-benefit ratio of drugs they may take for several years. Equally important is understanding that antidepressants are only one aspect of psychiatric treatment, which should first focus on other means of improving quality of life in patients. Sadly, psychiatric drugs have consistently shown to be only fairly efficient, well below the criteria of clinical significance required for first-line treatment. This means that the so-called alternative medicine, and other holistic practices, often ridiculed for allegedly being unsupported by scientific evidence, may as well be just as efficient as the so-called primary pharmacological treatment, and may even be preferable for the patient in the long term. Thus, like in other fields of science, inconclusive or unsatisfactory results point to the need for new research, and most importantly, new approaches in the sciences of the mind, hopefully beyond the reductionist and scientifically unsupported physicalist interpretation. As we shall see, there is substantial evidence for daring new hypotheses which could lead to a better understanding of both mind and body, and to a much-needed evidence-based practice in psychiatry, where primary care focuses on the present and future well-being of patients, rather than turning them into dependent, and often lifelong consumers of psychiatric drugs. After all, the fundamental purpose of medicine is to provide better treatments and better outcomes, not for industry, but for the patients themselves. Much to the detriment of people suffering from mental disorders, the view of the mind as a product of the brain means that they are often left with generic, physiological explanations of their disorders, too often incompatible with the intensity of the distressing mental conditions they deal with on a daily basis. In the same way, a wide variety of symptoms that they report are conveniently dismissed as hallucinatory or imaginary, only further aggravating their sense of alienation. Yet, how can a health professional accurately determine that a given mental phenomenon is unreal, if quantum physicists are no longer sure what real is? Could mental phenomena exist and operate within, and also outside the limited scope of objective reality? Sadly, the materialistic worldview pervading the sciences of the mind has proven to be a severe impediment to their development, and to limit our capacity to grasp the depth, complexity and nuances of uncommon mental phenomena, a topic to be further analyzed in other episodes of Do You Mind? The bottom line is that new approaches are needed, even if this means investigating bizarre and seemingly irrational hypotheses, just as it is the case for quantum physicists, with their hypothetical multiverse and virtual particles. In the light of these considerations, let's take a look at psychological phenomena suggesting a form of independence for the mind, if not its nearly complete ascendancy over all biological structures and processes. Formerly known as multiple personality disorder, dissociative identity disorder, or DID, sees patients alternatively switch between two or more distinct personalities or identity states, who commonly have unique names, age, gender, personal history, and present distinct characteristics like voice tone, manners, and even different ethnicity and language. Some identity states may be aware of other states and talk about them in the third person. Patients with this condition can feel the presence of two or more identities talking or living inside their minds or feel possessed by them. One of the most controversial and misunderstood diagnoses in psychiatry, dissociative identity disorder, is reported to be 6 times more common in women than men. It is believed to be either trauma-induced, through severe abuse experienced in childhood, or the result of iatrogenic influences, that is, induced by the words of a psychotherapist on highly suggestible patients. Malingering, the intentional fabrication of fantasy identity states or social role-taking, was also considered to cause such disorder. However, a controlled functional magnetic resonance imaging perfusion study by Schlumpf et al. Demonstrated that mentally healthy women, high and low fantasy-prone women, and actors motivated and instructed to simulate 2 different prototypes of dissociative parts, were unable to simulate the psychophysiological and neural activation patterns of these dissociative parts in women with dissociative identity disorder. Reinders et al. Corroborated such findings using regional cerebral blood flow imaging, which found important differences regarding regional cerebral blood flow and psychophysiological responses for different types of identity states in patients with DID. In other words, this study not only showed that DID patients had genuinely different activation patterns from those of healthy individuals, but that different identity states caused different neurological patterns to occur within the same brain. Such results have also shown to be inconsistent with the idea that DID is caused by suggestion, fantasy proneness, and role-playing. How can such evidence be accommodated within the physicalist interpretation? If the mind is a product of the brain, then we ought to see slight variations, such as those observed in actors simulating personality changes, but not entirely unique patterns, let alone major physiological alterations, such as state-dependent, psychogenic blindness. A case study by Strasburger and Waldvogel reported sight and blindness in the same person with DID, where some identity states could see, and others were blind. Some identity states who were blind recovered sight under psychotherapy, while others remained blind, which was demonstrated using visual evoked potentials. Of equal importance is the fact that DID patients often show state-dependent amnesia, where a given identity state cannot recall an event that occurred, while another state was in control of the body. The underlying mechanism of such a phenomenon remains misunderstood, and surely presents a considerable challenge to the assumption that memories are stored in cells or molecules. If memories are indeed stored in the brain or body, why aren't they equally accessible to all identity states? We shall emphasize that state-dependent amnesia can be neutralized or reinstated at will, through the suggestion of a trained therapist, which causes the patient to change to an identity state with no recollection of events or memories that were being discussed minutes or seconds before. What exactly do we see here? the brain instantly rewiring itself, or the mind accessing mostly non-physiological mental content that is exclusively available to the current persona or identity state. Does this phenomenon remotely suggest a non-local, quantum-like property for both memory and mental processes? Instead of conveniently or dogmatically dismissed, this probability should be seriously investigated by cognitive neuroscientists. The fact that a DID patient can be instructed or triggered to switch from one identity state to another by a therapist clearly indicates that it is the mind that causes neurological patterns to change, and not the opposite. Such evidence suggests a considerable level of ascendance of the mind over brain circuitry and consequently, the entire body, precisely the opposite of what physicalists wish to believe. Furthermore, where do additional identity states come from, in patients that were never subjected to abuse? What underlying mechanism would allow a mind to generate complete personalities, along with genuine, unique neurological patterns? Such complex questions on the fundamental nature of the mind are seemingly of little importance to researchers, who deem it sufficient to vaguely label such a disorder, and provide equally superficial treatment, whose results are often misunderstood by the professionals themselves. For example, the mostly unsuccessful, or short-lived attempts at merging all identity states into the apparently normal one. These findings also shed some light on another assumption in neuropsychiatry, which claims that mental illnesses are, in great part, the result of neurochemical imbalances in the brain. What if such alterations were instead psychosomatic symptoms, being themselves the result of a purely mental cause? Could this be the reason for the relative inefficacy of antidepressants? As documented by Pouillon et al., the mental health of patients in the placebo or control group, who believe to be properly medicated, may not only improve, but they may even report side effects, clearly demonstrating that it is not mainly the brain that affects the mind, but the mind that alters brain chemistry. To a larger extent, such a causation reversal also allows us to see somatization, mental disorders, and even certain physiological illnesses, as an externalization process for conscious, or unconscious mental content or states, and consequently, as a healing process for the psyche, a topic to be further analyzed in other episodes of Do You Mind? A variety of other mental disorders can also provide valuable insights on the mind, including but not limited to phobias, panic disorder, psychosis, depression, and schizophrenia. Yet, we shall resume our analysis of such disorders in another episode, once we have covered other topics and approaches, which may lead to a better understanding of their respective etiologies or causes. In an article for Science magazine on cause and effect in biology, evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr quoted celebrated 19th century physiologist Claude Bernard, who stated, "We admit that the life phenomena are attached to physico-chemical manifestations, but it is true that the essential is not explained thereby. For no fortuitous coming together of physico-chemical phenomena constructs each organism after a plan and a fixed design, which are foreseen in advance, and arouses the admirable subordination and harmonious agreement of the acts of life. Determinism can never be anything but physico-chemical determinism. The vital force and life belong to the metaphysical world." In the next episode, we shall have a closer look at evidence that defies a purely neurological causation for the mind, when patients with severe brain damage regain full awareness and cognition, shortly before their passing. We will also look at a growing and coherent body of evidence suggesting that the mind may, in fact, survive bodily death, when patients actually die, but do come back to tell. All this, and much more, on Do You Mind?